Hi, my name is Bianca. I'm a first-year MIT student, and you're listening to CHRW.
You're listening to the forum on CHRW. This is a place for students to ask questions and hopefully foster conversations. It is a safe place for students to come in and ask the questions that might be on their mind without fear of how they're going to be judged. It is for the students and by the students, which means you're not going to hear lecturers and professors come in, but it's simply going to be students asking questions and maybe sparking a conversation.
And we're back. You know what? I'm just going to roll with that on the forum because I say it every time, and then I say, no, we weren't. We were just sitting here discussing. But we actually were sitting here and discussing. We had some great conversations. And I need to do something with that conversation we just had because it's absolutely fantastic. But it's not going to be on this episode. I'll tell you what I'm going to do with it later. Mm-hmm. But before we left for the commercials, you touched on something, and it's a term that's been floating around sort of in the racism community for a while, and that is colorblind. Mm-hmm. And when I say colorblind, I'm not saying somebody who can't tell the color of your hair. Mm-hmm. I mean, the term is initially used to say that I don't see race, I don't see color, and then some people argue that you're obliterating somebody's culture and stuff like that. And I want your thought on the term colorblind. You know, we were talking about it in regards to, you know, police matters and stuff like that, but just the term in general, colorblind, as applies to racism, and then I'll chime in on it.
Colorblindness, I think, really blew up in the 1990s, where everyone was kind of trying to say, look, we're all human, we are not, you know, I'm not black, and we still hear the sentiment, I'm not black, I'm human. And unfortunately, the term abstracts social and historical backgrounds that have brought us to this very existence right now. Even though I think there are areas of the world that don't see a lot of or even any racial difference, I think in those places, I mean, you can claim colorblindness because, you know, there is no...
I would almost argue the other way for that, because if you're going to... one of my friends actually just recently went to China, and he sent me this picture of him. So his girlfriend was taking a picture of him, and he is surrounded by Chinese taking pictures of him because they just don't see black people, period. So I would almost argue that, like, they're more sensitive to the race because, you know, it's something new and something different. But I see what you meant. I just had to chime in.
Yeah. No, totally. But I mean, like, amongst themselves, maybe not as much until an outsider comes in and then they realize, oh, there's difference. Oh, we look different. Oh my God. You know, we look different as humans. And I think that's when color comes into play. But in regards to erasure of culture, it's a really tricky issue, at least to me, because there are incidences where, yes, race is a factor. And, you know, when we're talking about court trials, you know, we can look at, like, the case with Sami Atom, you know, an Arab man who had a mental health issue and was shot 8 or 9 times. Yes. And then the officer was charged for only attempted murder.
Yeah. Oh, you keep picking instances where my Toronto Police Department just fails epically. That I'm not going to get into that one because you will actually see me get mad.
I know, but I mean, that is an incident where I say we can't just look at colorblindness because I think, or we can't just say that was a colorblind incident because there are certain ideologies present, that all Arabs are terrorists, all blacks are criminals, all Latinos are drug dealers, all Asian folks, you know, I don't know what the discrimination is there in regards to a negative one, but, you know, or for them they get the expressionless, but there is anxiety. I can go on.
Well, that's actually where we start getting into the model minority.
Yes.
And actually in that instance, their perceived benefits actually hurts them.
Yes.
In that they're actually, well, we don't have to worry about racism with you.
Yeah.
You know, so while it might not be perceived as a negative, there's still a negative connotation.
Yes, there's still a negative one. And yes, and that model minority or the noble savage rhetoric does come about for them. But it doesn't disadvantage them as much economically in the way that it would for someone who is black or native or Hispanic. Yeah. But yeah, I just think colorblindness is super tricky because
It is, but so this is where I'll chime in, and then you mentioned the '90s, and I'm like, oh crud, that's where I was going to high school. Okay, so
Yes.
that actually makes a whole lot of sense. So how colorblind is when I say it, and I think this is where we start coming into the disparity of terms that are being used. When I come to choose my friends, I'm colorblind in that I don't care what color you are. If we click, if we're good, we're friends. I don't care. But beyond that, of course, I recognize that you're a black man, and that everything that comes along with that, and where you grew up, and all those sort of things. So, and I guess thinking of it that way, the other thing I was going to mention is, like, when I was an employer and when I was hiring people, or well, I guess I wasn't the employer, but I was hiring anyway. I always said that I was colorblind because when you came in to apply for a job, I didn't care what your color was. What I cared was on your resume, how you presented yourself and stuff like that. But I guess even in that aspect, not for me personally, because I've tried very, very hard, but I guess for a lot of employers, while it shouldn't be a factor, even though they say they're colorblind, they're going to start thinking, okay, well, you are a black guy, like, where do you live? Is this going to, and these shouldn't be factors. So I guess I see what you're saying, but I guess what I stand to is sort of the ideal of what colorblind should be, when we do have to realize that in reality people are using it to cover up any sort of systemic racism.
Exactly.
And this is why we have these conversations, because people who think of something see it from the other side. Okay. So cool. David just had an epiphany on the radio. It was awesome.
This is what I do.
So how do we get to the point of essentially the ideological colorblindness? Like,
Oh gosh,
I'm asking you all the good questions today.
I know this is hard because the trouble is the term post-racial, because colorblindness assumes that we are past race, that race is no longer a category, and that we do not see difference anymore. And the problem is, how can we see past difference when we haven't explored what difference really is? And what that requires, again, and I'm going to come back to this, is stories. We need to hear the stories of each person. In the example that you gave of getting to know friends that you just happen to connect with, eventually, or probably almost immediately, you start sharing stories. And in that, you begin to see the differences in your growing up. You begin to see the differences in certain things that you're faced with from day to day. Even just your name. Your name is Dave. My name is Ryan. If our names were unpronounceable on radio, suddenly that is a racial category. Even if one of us was, from Sweden, suddenly there's an othering that is happening. And when we start to talk about it in the site of job interviews and applications, one of the things that I was told from a mother who was growing up in the 70s is that she didn't have to work as hard at school because she knew when her name was seen on the top of her resume, they were going to hire her over someone's name that they couldn't pronounce. Unfortunately, 35 years later, my boss said the same thing. A former boss, of course, said that if your name was Shabab or Kebab, I'm not calling you into work. And yes. And so this is where colorblindness becomes a tricky thing. It's a great idea in the sense of seeing beyond race, but unfortunately we do see race, even if unconsciously, and sometimes we act in ways that we're not always completely in control of.
Yeah, I think it needs to be the ideal, that this is the something to attain. But I think it comes down to it. In certain situations, you need to essentially be colorblind. But at the same time, you can't be colorblind all the time because, then it does actually be, and I think you can't eliminate somebody's background, somebody's history, because that's what makes them who they are. As I said, I don't care what color you are to be my friend, but who you are, where you came from, is what allows you to be my friend and part of what I want from you. I want those stories. I want those. And that's what we need to get to. But at the same time, so, Sarah, our news director here, forwards me all these wonderful articles on Facebook. That would be the one that I just got gnarly at a minute ago. But she actually forwarded this one that had a really, really interesting concept, and I think this sort of forwards, and I want to get your opinion on it before we move on to the next topic. But the idea of at least first rounds of interviews, removing names, just flat out removing them. It was actually talking about it from a gender point of view, because you can tell the difference most of the time between a male and a female name. But I think even, as you pointed out, like there's cultural names that come with this. And before I let you answer, just to give the example it did, one of the big symphonies in the States, I want to say it was the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, in the 70s had about a 5% female population, which is ludicrous. When they started doing the first round of auditions, they started doing them behind a curtain, so you couldn't see who was playing. All of a sudden, within a very limited number of years, they were up to 40% female rate. So that, and these people were saying we're not trying to actively be sexist or anything, but as you said, there's a systemic, there's things that we have in our subconscious that we don't necessarily can do. So what would you think, like just as a suggestion of, like removing names for the first round of applications?
I say try it. I mean, if it is beneficial to your company, and I think it's a way of getting rid of the quota conversation or the affirmative action conversation, and not necessarily getting rid of in the sense of totally removing it from our lexicon, but more so as a way of looking at alternative options into exploring what affirmative action could look like, exploring what meeting quotas could look like when it's not necessarily even conscious. I'm consciously trying to reach the quota. So I chose this tokenized person that can fill our quota. Oh, look, they happen to be, gay and black, check. That's it for the rest of the interviewees, gates closed. And I like that idea. It just has to be one that is monitored and I don't know. I mean, I still think as long as it doesn't eliminate the conversation on, what does it mean that I have gender biases? What does it mean that I have racial biases?
I think it's just another way to start removing it from the conscious decision-making process. Where we need to eliminate those. Oh, you mentioned something. I didn't even think about sort of the quota system from that side of it. I always thought of it, oh my God, we have to fill these quotas, and that sort of stuff. But at the same time, I didn't even think about it as, I've never worked under a quota system. I think it's absolutely ridiculous. My big thing is equality and, bring people in based on who they are and the merits that they bring. But yeah, I need one gay guy and one black guy, but you're gay and black, so I'm done for the day. Like, that's a horrible idea. That's not okay in any way, shape.
Yeah.
But yeah, I can see how it can be used that way. Okay. Look at that. You're making me think all day today. So yeah, I just some other ideas, just some ideas to put out there. The ideas like that, I think, are the right direction. We need to sort of. Unfortunately, people do have biases, and where they come from it. I'm from Toronto. I'm a little bit more open-minded, though not everybody from Toronto is open-minded.
Yeah,
for sure. The imagination. Or Brampton.
Oh, Brampton. Oh, gosh.
But where I was living recently, the amount of discrimination up there was absolutely ridiculous. And if you were to implement a company-wide or even governmental policy that, in the first round, just removing this would be a fantastic idea. And I think more ideas like that need to come out. So in that, we're going to move to sort of the last thing, I guess maybe we're going to talk about, because I forgot to set my timer. But we're going to talk about your idea of interculturalism, but also how these cultures interact, how we interact with each other. And I'm going to start off with something you mentioned sort of out there, which nobody can see where I'm pointing to out there. You talked about the hyphenating. Yeah. So what do you mean by hyphenating?
So this idea that everyone's Canadian unless you're not white most times, and whiteness can be a ambivalent term, but I don't often hear folks, and I know there are folks who will identify themselves as Irish Canadian or Scottish Canadian, but most times, most folks who don't have to look into their background or ever get questioned about their background just say, I'm just Canadian. For myself, I often have to say I am Carib Canadian, because many folks are asking where I'm from. And the other conversation that comes in is, have you ever been to Jamaica? Have you been to Guyana? And I'm like, well, most people don't even know Guyana exists, which is another conversation in itself. And I'm like, and if I say I haven't been to Jamaica, folks are going off about how Jamaica is and whatever. And it's like, this is really kind of awkward for me because there is this notion that I'm the outsider who has been inside all along, but still an outsider.
Yeah. It's a really weird juxtaposition because I have this with some of my friends. One of my friends in Toronto was Sikh, except for his family has been here since like 1820. And habitually he would be asked where he's from, what part of India he's from and stuff like that. And he's like, I don't know, from Toronto, man. Yeah. Whereas my family, I'm a first generation Canadian. My family's actually from the UK. Mm-hmm. So it was just, they're like, well, but what you're talking about is sort of when people say Canadian, they automatically think of the sort of stereotypical white Canadian, and everybody else has to sort of identify them as their race, or even, context of origin is, like somebody would expect him to say that he was Sikh Canadian, whereas, God, he's been Canadian longer than I have.
Right.
Well, actually, I was older than him, but that's besides.
I get what you mean. Just historically speaking,
yeah.
And it is a kind of awkward moment because. Then, okay, so you want me to be Carib Canadian? Okay, so let me talk about my Robinson last name. So, Robinson is to be son of Robin, meaning that my original name or family line was erased. It's gone. And now I have been baptized in white Christianity, and I come from a line of family that were on the sugar plantations and were slaves. And folks get suddenly very uncomfortable with that conversation, but they're very comfortable asking where I'm from. And then I'm like, okay, well, are you really down to know where I'm from? Or are you just down to know that I'm from outside?
I think oh, God, we hit on one of my big points that I haven't been really ready to talk about yet, but I think this is a great time, and I think it's a great person to talk with it about. Mm-hmm. This sort of comes to the conversation. I think part of the conversation is how you approach it. Mm-hmm. Well, and the other side as well. You're 100% right. The vast majority of people are very, very comfortable if you come from somewhere else, but they don't really want to know about that sort of history. But at the same time, a lot of people, when they talk about slavery or something like that, particularly when they're talking to a white person, automatically expect this sort of, oh, I'm sorry. And the reality comes from, I'm curious about that. I really am. I got, when I was working at the Chatham Kent Festival, because Chatham was sort of one of the last stops for the Underground Railroad, I got really, really into the history, not mostly because the people I was working with made me, which I'm really glad that they did. My family never owned slaves. My family had nothing to do with the slave trade ever, as far back as we can go. So when I have met people that actually literally wanted me to apologize for white slavery, and I'm like, but I had nothing to do with that. And furthermore, I personally never had anything to do with this. So I think two sides. One, if you're going to ask somebody where they're from, be prepared to know where they're from and to know their history, because that is singly important. It's who they are. At the same time, what do you expect from the other person? So my question to you is, and I'm sorry if I'm putting you on the spot, but it's what I do. When you start talking about your last name and that sort of erasure of history, and if you're talking to a white person, if you're talking to me, what do you expect from me?
So in that conversation, it depends on the type of interaction. So if I know this person, having people off the streets ask me this question.
Have they?
Yes.
Really?
I'm just going to go by my LTC pass, and people are like, it's cold out. Where are you from? I'm like, I don't live in a fridge, you know what I mean? Like I have human skin, and you know what I mean? Like, it gets cold, what would you expect me to say? We're all cold.
What you don't see right now is I'm literally on the floor laughing.
And so this is where I'm like, okay, like, what answer do you really expect me to give? Whereas if it's somebody who I've known for some time and I start dropping, those heavy topics, then okay, I assume that you're ready to have this conversation because you've been around me long enough. Especially when, if you mess up my name by chance or something rather, and I'm like, okay, I don't really care about my last name. And why don't you care about your last name? Because of this.
Okay.
So, yeah, I'm not expecting, for you to bow down and recognize that, oh my God, I'm white and like I feel so ashamed. No, what I want is for you to recognize that it happened and be like, okay, well,
That's us.
and then also, I have other names that I use, and that could be a conversation too.
Mm-hmm. I guess it's better to let somebody self-label themselves than to ever assign a label to somebody else. I guess is that sort of where we're going with this?
I think that's the better option, and hopefully the self-labeling is happening after being informed as to maybe a suggested label. And if you're going to defy a label, know why you're defying that label. I would like for informed decisions on things like that.
That again, we're talking about the ideal. Yeah, that would be awesome. Well,
I would hate to, meet a guy's like, I really like anime, so now I'm Japanese. I'm like, that's not.
You've met a few otaku in your life, haven't you?
Yeah.
I'm probably going to get in trouble for that. Please comment on that one. Only because, so we'll talk about that one because the otaku culture is kind of interesting in that way. Growing up, one of my best friends growing up, his name was Tim. Was Japanese.
Yeah.
He was a first gener like I was, but his parents were from Japan and his older brother was from Japan. And he was big into Gundam, which is a type of anime. And big giant robots, 8 years old. Man, I was into it. And I have been ever since. And I've actually been into anime for a very, very long time because I had friends from Japan who probably... I never once thought of myself as Japanese. But if you... There comes this... We're coming down to that... Oh, see, look. We sort of come down to that point where we need to start worrying about cultural appropriation versus cultural appreciation. And... That's something I've been wanting to talk about, but everybody's afraid to talk about that. That's the big one that everybody gets afraid of, because cultural appropriation is a huge hot button topic. It's huge at the university right now. But we'll talk about that in a minute. That was my timer, so we're hitting the end of the episode. Is there anything you'd like to say? I'm going to give you a couple of minutes of just free speech without me talking over you.
Okay. So one of the reasons why I wanted to speak about racial disparity, diversity, as you can see, there is a plethora of ways this manifests itself when we start talking about institutional racism, which is the structures at play within healthcare, education, housing, unemployment, individual racism, which has to do with, being held up by custody, the police officers dealing with you, the judicial, the court, the pretrial, all of that. And also something called differential treatment, which has to do with a certain group of people committing a certain amount of, or a certain crime over and over and being overrepresented. And I think that conversation starts generating how we start to look at groups of people and spans out into multiple ways that identity becomes a place of politics and that the two aren't separate. So when you decide that you're apolitical, you are engaging in politics. There is no out, unfortunately. And so by taking neutral positions, you are usually choosing the side of the oppressor to let them do whatever they want. So this is why I think this type of conversation is needed to be had, and so that we can also complicate what diversity actually means.
I'm good.
We're good.
I really don't want to step over you, but so I one thing I just want to chime in for you is that by choosing to do nothing, you've chosen a side. So stand up and let your voice be heard and make sure your voice is heard.
Definitely.
And to just continue on, when we start talking, this conversation that we just had, we meandered all over the place.
Yeah, we did.
Which is actually a really, really good thing, because when we start talking about diversity, we start talking about racism, we start talking about gender inequality and all that sort of stuff, it leads to so many different places. And while certain conversations do need to be kept on sort of the narrow path and to achieve something, in overall, to achieve awareness, to achieve moving forward as people, we need to just have the conversation and let it go, as long as it goes in a productive manner, which I think this one did.
Yeah, I think so too.
Thank you so much for joining me, Ryan.
Nice.
This has been The Forum. Thank you for joining.